Welcome to the Secret Sun Video Mystery Hour. We have a very, very special guest. We have Dana from Rotting Jewels, and the topic of tonight's discussion is going to be American Gladio. Secret Sun readers and watchers and listeners know these topics have been rather well covered in my blog, and Dana has a much different take on things and is getting into some very, very deep dives that I think you guys are really going to enjoy. So let's start this off, Dana. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am from Florida and I am an ICU nurse. And yeah, I just read the Franklin scandal and that book, The Brothers, about Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles. And I said,
Mm.
well, now that I know all of this, I'm going to make it everyone else's problem. And that's how I got on the internet.
Oh my goodness. So I see you in Tampa. You must see a lot of do you see a lot of crazy kind of patients come through? I mean, is there a lot of street crime and so on going on over there?
There's a lot of, depending on the time of year, gunshot wounds, gang related incidents, car accidents, and then obviously when the Rona was making its rounds, that was quite chaotic, but I was on the road for that for part of the time. So
What about fentanyl? Is there a lot of fentanyl down there?
that's kind of like a hit or miss. It's really interesting. We have a lot of meth overdoses. Like I've had patients die from meth. Now I
Wow.
don't know if it's cut with something weird because like we see the blood chemistry panel and then the urine chemistry panel,
Mm,
and we expect to see, marijuana or something like that with it. That's pretty typical, maybe alcohol, but these meth users are coming in and it's just showing meth, but like they have a stroke or they have a heart attack and they don't recover. It's very bizarre.
that's horrible. Well, meth
Yeah.
will do that to you, definitely,
Yeah.
especially if you have preconditions, if you have a pre-existing any kind of coronary situation. Um, but even young people, that stuff will drop.
Mm.
That really gets your heart racing. So you started off reading about Alan Dulles and the Franklin scandal. That was a pretty deep initiation. I mean, you went straight into the deep end.
I really
You didn't go
did.
into the kiddie pool at all. You just went straight into the deep stuff. So how long ago was this for you?
It was about a year and a half ago. So I read The Brothers, then I read The Devil's Chessboard. I read a couple other books. I think it's the same author who wrote The Brothers, and he did a book about Mohammad Mossadegh and everything that happened in Iran. So
Mm,
I read that, and then he did another one about like Sidney Gottlieb. It was totally a limited hangout about Sidney Gottlieb, but it was still a good book in general. And then obviously the Franklin scandal, and then I just went full blown noited with Aberration and the Heartland of the Real and Program to Kill. So
wow. Did you read Chaos Inc.?
yes, yes,
What was your take on that?
I think it was great. I think he did a good job, and I feel that it's kind of it speaks to our justice system that
Oh yeah.
that was proved that it was such a damning lie and a cover up on so many levels that he couldn't even break down all of the cover ups and nothing happened, right?
Mm,
And that's
yeah.
crazy to me.
Yeah. What did you think of the fact that he didn't really talk about the process at all?
That's where my hang up is kind of right now. I know that he's working on a supplemental book. I don't know if it's going to be a full second book, but I'm curious if he's going to touch on that or not, because that just seems to be something that people don't really want to talk about. And I wonder
Well, they'll
why.
sue you.
Well, yeah,
They'll sue
they're,
you.
yeah, they're
Um,
a little litigation happy.
yeah, they get pretty aggressive, especially if you bring best friends into it, which you have done. on numerous occasions on your Twitter, these epic Twitter threads that you've done, which are really rather impressive. I mean, I've been really blown away by the scope of your studies. Now, the Sidney Gottlieb book, was that, what was that called? The Poisoner? Is that
The
what?
Poisoner in Chief.
Poisoner in Chief, right? Yeah. I read some of that and I did all the MK Ultra stuff out there. I really get a very strong limited hangout vibe from.
Me too.
Uh, yeah, and I know that was it Annie Jacobson did the book. She did the book on the remote viewers phenomenon, and then she did the book on Area 51, which was just there's a lot of good information in there, but I thought it was like pretty pretty much indicated that she got the talk, the talk.
Absolutely. I feel the same way. Like I read Operation Paperclip and the Pentagon's Brain, where she talks about like the early DARPA technology in Vietnam, and like the Jason group. And it's like that was a limited hangout at some point. There was a certain point of what they were letting her put out. And I mean, it's not that it wasn't well written and that it wasn't informative, but it wasn't, I think, a full study into what was actually going on.
Well, I think when you get access, they set parameters for you. It's like, okay, we'll tell you this much, but we don't want to talk about this. And Tom O'Neill has really covered that. I mean, he talked about how Bugliosi just went completely haywire on him, just freaked out several times. And I think it was because there's this unspoken kind of gentleman's agreement that these guys will talk to you, but never implicate them in anything and never touch the third rails of conspiracy lore, I guess you would say. I mean, don't talk about, well, for instance, the process. I mean, just the fact that the process is nowhere in that book was, I mean, even like the theories and the fact that Charlie wrote an article for the Process magazine on death. I mean, just not mention them even in passing. This really struck me as I don't know. It definitely seems that it could be that he's afraid of litigation. So one question that I didn't put on my list, but I while we're on these subjects, what was your thinking on Maury Terry and Ultimate Evil?
So I've read the book in full once, and I'm like slowly working my way through a second listening. My initial read, I thought he did a fantastic job. I think that he cited everything well. I do think that he had a I guess you could say, knack for trying to kind of gatekeep or take claim to some of the information, and I don't fault him for it. I know he was probably put through hell just like Ed Sanders with the family, because the process
Mm,
came after him. So I
mm-hmm.
think that those are valid things to consider. Like we all say that we would do better, right? But like it's easy to say that on the outside.
Yeah.
But as far as the ultimate evil and the massive files that are out there, not all of them, but enough where you can see that there is multiple corroborations for those crimes, where they're saying that there were other people present at those crimes, that there were other people involved in those crimes. And it's
And the
for some.
witnesses too. I mean, the witness sketches and but this is why I want to get into the Carr brothers in just a second. But the reason I ask is that I've heard a wide range of opinions on both Mauritari and the Ultimate Evil. Some people thought that he just went way overboard and made too much, maybe of too little, that he went far beyond the bounds of where the actual evidence was. I mean, that's any journalist, particularly back then, mass market paperback journalists and so on. But I see him, I've seen him as essentially a straight up guy. Maybe he gilded the lily a few times, but you kind of have to. You know what I mean? It's the horrible truth. Like I said, when you're trying to sell a mass market paperback, you have to you have to pump it up a little. But so you basically feel that his thesis concerning Son of Sam process and so on and the Carr brothers is what? What's your takeaway? Because I know you had spoken about the Carr brothers, and I was having a little trouble following the thread, and I wanted to know what your opinion was on the Carr brothers' involvement.
So, from my opinion, and I'll start with really honestly, I need to start with the dad because I think that the dad is also involved. And this is where, certain people that are surviving family members of the Carr family are also getting very litigation happy, as I
Mm,
anticipated. But Michael Vale Carr III, the second son that passed away, that got into a car accident. So in the book, it talks about how he is a Scientologist, and it's insinuated that
mm,
he was a ranking Scientologist. We don't have a lot of details, though, about that as far as when he went in, what his role was, X, Y, and Z. Now, I've been working with these elderly Scientology whistleblowers, and they said we need to look through the old auditor magazines. So, this was a monthly publication that L. Ron Hubbard put out, and it would list every single person, what class they took, what have you. Well, come to find out, there's two Michael Carrs in Scientology. Now, one is going clear in Los Angeles in 1968. Michael
mm,
Vale Carr III is going clear maybe like roughly a decade later. Initially, I thought that it was Michael Vale Carr that was in Los Angeles because they do the Guardian's office, the church's old CIA before Operation Snow White, when the FBI came in and shut everything down. That was
mm,
the old Office of Special Affairs of today. So they're known to recruit people for intelligence through the Guardian's office. You go clear super quick, and then you kind of disappear from the magazines. But as we're looking through all of these, we see there's Michael Carr and then there's Michael Carr III. They said, and one of the gentlemen that I'm working with, he used to work in education in the church with these higher ranking intelligence people, and he said they would not put the third even if you asked for it unless there was a family member that was also in the church at the same time.
mm,
Now, Sam, I was looking through the old newspapers and I found the lottery draft for the, when they draft for the war. I found his original record of when he went in, and in the newspaper in that lottery draft, it says Michael Samuel Carr. The date lines up perfectly.
mm,
Grandfather Carr, his name is Michael. So is grandpa number one, Sam is number two, and then Michael Vale Carr is number three. So I posited the theory that I believe that the Michael Carr that was going clear in Los Angeles in 1968 is Sam, son of Sam. And then the younger Carr that we know is a Scientologist, he goes clear in New York at a later time. Obviously, this complicates the entire case if Sam is actually a Scientologist. Now, I
mm,
have another reason for this, and this was kind of the nail in the coffin for me until I see a birth certificate, which I have requested and it has been refused, and I've been threatened with a lawsuit. But there is an interview with D.A. Lifer, and they are interviewing Francis Carr, Sam Carr, and Wheat Carr. And they're asking about Michael's time in the Church of Scientology. And in the beginning of the interview, they're kind of evasive. It's a 9 to 5, and, he was very proud of his job, XYZ. Later on in the interview, Lifer asks again, and you can tell like he's getting a little more aggressive. Like there's questions that he wants answered, and it seems like he has information, but he doesn't want to show his hand. And so
mm,
he's asking again, and the mom, Frances, is saying, well, why are you asking this? Well, she starts jumbling up her answers. That is the only time in that interview that Sam puts his foot down and says, gentlemen, I'm going to need you guys to step out. I need to speak with my family for a minute. when they're asking about Michael in Scientology. So, in my opinion, I think that Michael was in Scientology, but I think he was also screwing around with the process because I do think that John was part of the process. I think that they were likely getting into some type of trouble as far as what they were doing because you got to think like all those arsons that were going on, it was like over 100 arsons and all these other seemingly unrelated crimes and these crime reported occult crimes going on in North Dakota. You know what I mean? they were
Yeah.
bringing they were bringing bad attention. That's what they were doing. They were bringing very unwanted attention. um I think, in my opinion, that along with Berkowitz, I don't think that he's innocent by any means. I do think that he was a patsy, though. I think that both of the car boys were screwing around with the process, and I am of the opinion that the Son of Sam letters was a black PR campaign from the Church of Scientology. And here's my reason why. So the organization that Michael worked out of in New York is the same organization that Paulette Cooper, those black ops that were run on Paulette Cooper by the church, where she was framed for a bomb threat to Henry Kissinger and she was sent to jail and she had to go to trial twice, where they were able to forge fingerprints and a letter and literally have a woman sent to prison for a fake bomb threat to Henry Kissinger. He was working in the exact same organization at the same time. So nobody can look me in the face and be a serious person and say that they couldn't go to David Berkowitz's apartment and do the same thing, that accomplish
Mm.
the exact same thing. And it's just the way that it was. The first letter wasn't given to the press, and then the second letter was given to the press, and we have this massive engagement with with Breslin, right? Jimmy Breslin. We have this, back and forth with Jimmy Breslin in the press. And I think that the church was running a black PR campaign on the Carr family. That's what I think those letters were, because I think that the Carr boys were probably bringing a lot of negative attention. There is a whistleblower from the church that is no longer with us. His name is Arnie Lerma. He is on record. This was a month before he died. Is it related? Don't know. But he was talking to the legal counsel for Tony Ortega, who is a journalist. He runs the Underground Bunker. I also see him as controlled opposition. However, he was speaking with his legal counsel, who was at the Rory mission, which I don't know where that is. But they were stating that Michael Carr was given an EOC order, which is an end of cycle order or a take your own life order, and that's why he drove his car into a pole.
Now, from who? Who specifically issued the EOC order
The
in your
church.
in your opinion? So
The
the church did.
church.
Now, here's an interesting thing. So Sam Carr is allegedly in, and I'm just when I use the term allegedly, you understand why I'm
Sure.
using the term allegedly. He's in Los Angeles in 1968, which would put him in the vicinity of Charlie and the Family and the Beach Boys. Now, that seems to be kind of a gimme. I think most people would pick up on that. But let me tell you what kind of is eating at the back of my consciousness here when you talk about the Carr family and all this Scientology related nonsense going on in New York. I mean, I realize this is Yonkers, right? Which is a little bit different. But I'll tell you something. I think about that there was this whole class of New York-based people, John Travolta being the most prominent thereof. At the same time, all this Son of Sam nonsense is going on. We have these people being brought into the church, particularly New York people, celebrities, musicians. Chick Corea, I think, is one of them. Um, who else? Edgar Winter. Um, a number of different actors as well, whose names are escaping me at the moment, but you know, this is a fresh thought in my head here, so you'll have to forgive me. But That is really curious to me because I remember those. I'm old enough to remember those times. I mean, I was very young, but I remember Son of Sam and all that kind of stuff. When I think of Son of Sam, I think about Welcome Back, Kotter. I mean, it sounds kind of strange, right? But for
No.
some reason, I associate those two in my mind, and I think of like the film The Warriors, which I'm sure had a bunch of Scientologists in its cast. Now, we know that the church is not what it once was, that it's speaking of Clearwater, right? Um, we know that the church is not what it once was, that its power has been diminished, that a lot of people have come out of the church itself and spoken up against it, Leah Remini being, foremost among them. But what do you make of this weird timing? Because it seems like happenstance, but in my brain, it's kind of like my sinuses start to swell up when I start to feel like these deeper connections. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about that. Is the Scientology organization somehow involving themselves allegedly in extremely nefarious activities as some sort of, I don't know, control mechanism, recruiting mechanism? I mean, is there some connection there? Because I feel like there is.
Well, I will state this is my personal opinion and also based off of personal interaction with some of these people. I don't believe that Leah Remini has left at all. And I also feel the same way personally about Mr. Mike Rinder. Um, the reason for this is a lot of my process best friends research. She gets really jumpy. She's blocked me. She will delete any comments that anybody leaves asking about the proven fact that the process is Best Friends Animal Society. I've traced these people from the UK to Utah. They are the exact same people. They get very uncomfortable about that. So the way that I view the current movement, and obviously this has been going on for maybe a decade or so now since the TV show was on. Uh, I see them as controlled opposition. That's what I
Mm.
view that whole thing as.
Well, what about the 70s stuff though? Getting back to this whole New York, because there was a lot of crazy stuff going on in New York. I mean, this is when the magical child is operant. This is where the Simon Necromonicon comes from, Peter Lavender and those people. Do you do you see what I'm getting at? I mean, this might be way too far out on a limb, but just as pure speculation, I mean, do you feel that because the fingerprints of the process are sort of on these things, on these events, and we'll be very vague about these things, that there was some connection, maybe it's some rogue faction within the church, I don't know. But it just seems to me like something is just bothering me, and I'm wondering if you pick up on that as well.
So let's take it to just a simple explanation of the beginning. So, as far as the process goes, they were never actually treated as a squirrel group or as defectors. Yes, Robert and Marianne de Grimston were declared, but they were declared at the exact same time that L. Ron Hubbard started the Guardian's office. So, in my personal opinion, they were given orders to start this movement and to go separately. So when you really look at some of L. Ron's older readings and you look at the old process readings, the way that I describe it, and these whistleblowers agree, is that the process is just a black mirror. It's just a darker mirror of Scientology. Because Scientology, if you're a high ranking Scientologist, that's almost like a status symbol. You think of celebrities, wealth, and with the process, that's not necessarily the case, so you can kind of take anybody off of the street if they're willing to play ball. Um, Now, in regards to whether it's Manson or it's in New York, L. Ron Hubbard and Mary Sue Hubbard, there are internal church documents. More so, I know the details about with Manson, but I know that there is mention of the crimes that were later attributed to David Berkowitz. They were aware of what was going on with the process as far as because they're using their tech, they're auditing people, they're using Hubbard's technology. They were more worried about the bad PR from Charles Manson. And for David Berkowitz, they were more worried about the bad PR from the crimes that were later attributed to David Berkowitz. Now, in the timeline, this is very interesting because Operation Snow White, the FBI raids them, I believe, the first or second week of July that year. And then about 6 weeks later, David Berkowitz is arrested. And as everybody knows, if you're familiar remotely with the case, he has in his pocket the Flag Land Base, which was the gold base in Clearwater for the Church of Scientology. That was in his pocket when he was arrested. So the way that I view the process is they're not rogue. I think that within the Church of Scientology itself there has to be a level of plausible deniability, even among like high-ranking intelligence officials. And L. Ron Hubbard and Mary Sue Hubbard have to have some level of plausible deniability. But I just see them, and it's been described this way in FBI reports and in immigration services reports. They're like the strong arm, they're the muscle for the church. That's what they
Mm.
do. But obviously, because their, root theology, when they start, has four different deities, and so they can infiltrate every movement, as I'm showing people, they have these splinter or cell groups that come off of that original process church of the final judgment.
Well, here's the thing though, with the process. So I'll couch it this way. Let's say we had a group like the process that sort of traveled around Mexico, New Orleans, the Caribbean, somehow had the money to set up this large operation in, say, a very expensive and exclusive neighborhood in London, say, I don't know, Mayfair, for instance. I'm just spitballing here, but also in Boston and also in Los Angeles and San Francisco, plum real estate. Okay. Now, looking at, like, say, if I was going to write a fictional novel, completely fictional novel about a group like the process, but not, of course, the process. My take would be that it would be like a British intelligence operation that was funding itself through moving drugs around and had the perfect cover of this cult, where they could, scream First Amendment or persecution if somebody looked askance at them. They would have all these connections with musicians who are on tour and could be just touring things around. I mean, this is just purely hypothetical, but um, would there be an argument that this completely hypothetical group may not be a British intelligence operation, but may in fact be something like the muscle or the enforcement wing or maybe covert fundraiser for say a weird cult that has offices all around the country and the world? I mean, where would you fall on that? Do you think that there could be, in say this hypothetical group, connections to intelligence, or would it be more based in this church, so to speak?
So we're going to predicate this on hypotheticals and research that I have done. So we'll just kind of leave it for the people to determine. I'm not making specific claims. So the first person that I really dug into, he is deceased, was Timothy Wiley. His story just seemed very outrageous as far as like, oh, I'm hanging out with William S. Burroughs and Byron Geisen and Tangier, and we're hanging out with all these celebrities. My mom's British intelligence. Well, I was able to prove that. I have found the birth records. I have found her war records. She worked for the Office of Economic Warfare. So she was absolutely British intelligence. That has checked out. She is also buried in the city of London, which, if you know anything about the
Yeah,
city of
yeah.
London, that's super sus. And then I dug into so the narrative of Robert and Marianne and how they came to be, what people know is when they got together, Marianne, this, a very provocative and manipulative woman, convinces him to change his last name to de Grimston when they get married. That's actually not true. Mr. Robert de Grimston, hypothetically, but I've got the research up if people want to see it. He is black nobility. So he was actually chosen by the de Grimston family. It's a Lady Armitrude Wermock de Grimston. So I dug into both sides of his family, and it's very fascinating because his father worked for Butterfield and Swire, and so did his grandfather, who was a clerk of the Holy Orders for the Vatican, which is a common cloak for trafficking of all kinds, particularly at that time, opium during the Opium Wars.
Mm.
Butterfield and Swire was heavily involved in the monopoly in China at that time with opium. And it's a fascinating story as far as his grandfather and his father. His mother don't have so much of a history on her, but when his parents get married, and he is born in Shanghai. I found that. I found him on a ship manifest coming back to the UK when he was an infant. But when they come back to the UK, both of them go under the role of the air raid warden during World War II. And it's fascinating because when you watch the old propaganda videos, because one of my subscribers in the UK said that would be a perfect cover at that time. Go look at the propaganda videos because they would do test runs and the siren would go off and everybody had to go inside and they would have free reign to do whatever they wanted to do, and everybody had to stay inside until the next siren went off with the signal for you to come back. So I think that that's an interesting angle to consider. Now his sister Barbara Moore, she was the goddaughter of Lady Armitrude Wermock de Grimston, but that I have Robert de Grimston using Robert de Grimston and a combination of Robert Moore, Sylvester Moore, 4 years before he ever met Marianne. So that's the argument there that he was moved in to that family. Now, I will be coming back to this angle because I'm trying to confirm exactly which day Grimston it is, because it looks like this ties into like the Rhodesia lobby, which gets very confusing, but that also ties in with like Elrond's intelligence ties specifically. So
Mm.
there's still a lot of back work there, but I've at least been able to confirm these hypotheticals that we're presenting of a, I would argue, backed by both intelligence agencies, and that hypothetically these uh, churches are essentially front groups, modern day MK Ultra projects, as one could possibly call them.
So I want to lean into this a bit. So the Moors, I don't, I don't reckon they're any relation to Roger Moore, right?
No.
Um, when you talk about black nobility, do you mean like these Venetian families that sort of migrated up to England throughout the Middle Ages and or the late Middle Ages, or maybe even the Renaissance? I'm not exactly sure of the timelines because I know that people have talked about these groups originating in Venice. Now, does that track with your research?
So I'm going through because when you go online, I can't remember what they call them. It's like these massive blue books because these people are obsessed with tracing their DNA. I'm trying to figure out which side of Lady Armitrude Warmock de Grimston. I'm trying to figure out which side of the family it comes from because I'm trying to determine if this is tied under Lord Cecil specifically, because that obviously makes it cut and dry as far as what side of nobility he would come from. But this is it's very hard to like track all of these things down, and I haven't come back to that lately because I've been trying to kind of work through the different stages or phases that the process goes through. But I'm going to be coming back to that because I would like to do a full lineage on his family, because I think that the opium stuff with Butterfield and Swire, like that's a really interesting part of history for me. So I want to come back and look at both sides of his family, but this seems to be predominantly on his father's side.
Mm. Now, the Grimston family, so that would be the Moore family, is what you're saying.
Yeah, so Robert Moore, aka Robert de Grimston.
Now, the de Grimston family, where did you trace them to? Just, without going through the whole lineage, I mean, what's their basic origin story? Like, where do they come from? How do they make their way up to England? I mean, de Grimston is, what would that be? A French name? Or, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the,
So for Lady Armitude Wehrmacht, she takes it. So the day Grimston, the man that she married was not a Grimston. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, is where she takes over this role.
mm.
That's what I'm trying to figure out, is where does her lineage trace, because her mother passes away, and it's at that time shortly after that we see her taking on this formal name of the day Grimston. And I'm trying to figure out which side of her family it comes from, because it does not come from her husband.
No, they landed gentry, the de Grimstons.
I'm sorry.
Are they landed gentry, the de Grimston family?
I I don't know. I'm going to be honest with you.
That's okay. Let me ask, just sticking with the Grimston for a second. Did you ever watch that documentary on Cropsey, the Cropsey situation on Staten Island?
I just watched it. I just watched The Sons of Sam and then literally just watched Cropsey probably in the past 3 weeks.
Well, the thing that I was really curious about is what the hell de Grimston was doing on Staten Island at that time. I mean, talk about like nobody, Staten Island is a place you leave, it's not a place you stay. And I'm
Hmm.
just really curious as to why he's living there at that time when this stuff is going on with the Cropsey situation. Without getting into any legally perilous territory here, what is he doing? Why is he there? This is like this is not a place somebody with his peerage and lineage and pedigree is going to end up. I mean, it's a place where nobody ends up. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's like, what is going on there?
So it's very interesting, and this is why those documentaries became a very big red flag to me, because I didn't know anything about Willowbrook. I didn't know about Cropsey. I had no idea. And so the process had multiple publications, and one of the magazines was called The Process Scenes. And it is their holiday 1974 issue. And in this issue, it details their established volunteer program at Willowbrook. They had been at Willowbrook for years. I have pictures of them on the ferry going to Staten Island. I have pictures of them at the school with these children. They're also involved in other nursing homes at that time. Now, to be fair, I am some of these other publications, like years and months, they're very hard to get a hold of. But that one, when I pulled it up on my show, a bunch of people in the chat were like, that was left out of this documentary. And I was like, what documentary are you guys talking about? And so then I watched Cropsey and I said, well, isn't this an interesting trend that we have with some of these, what I would call propaganda pieces, because they're not being transparent or truthful.
Maybe they
And
just
I'm
didn't do the research, though. I mean, just to play devil's advocate here, I mean, that kind of research is maybe not something that they would dig into because maybe it just wasn't available or it wasn't well known. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, it's like their whole coverage of the process was very passing. Um, they didn't go in great depth into that topic per se. So I'm just wondering if like maybe it didn't even come under their radar.
In my opinion, I think that it was on purpose, but this is just my opinion. I think that there was a sort of narrative that was spun in regards to rumors of cult activities. And it's interesting in the Cropsey documentary, I think it was the thing that stuck out to me the most when they're interviewing that detective and they're like, could they theoretically do rituals in this abandoned school? And, and they ask him, does the cult use children? And the detective says, I'd rather not answer that question. And then they just
Mm,
cut scene and he never comes back on camera. um that bothers me a great deal because the process was in Pound Ridge. I have a DOJ piece of paper with one of their naturalization records, but it's from the Department of Justice. So they were still living at their Pound Ridge property in 1980.
and
They
Pine
didn't
Ridge
leave New York.
is where exactly?
So someone told me it's in Westchester County.
Hmm.
I don't know exactly where it is in Westchester County because I'm not really familiar with New York. I'm getting more familiar, but they bought this property in, I think, 1975, and they were there until at least 1980 at a bare minimum. And obviously, Robert was in Staten Island for much longer than that. So
So what was the story? I never could really nail down, was he working for Xerox or something? It was something like really random like that. The reason that he was in Staten Island, like I said, which is just like, I can't imagine for the life of me why he would be there. What was the explanation?
So that is rumors of him just kind of going corporate, he's selling out to the man, or as the process would say, he's joining the gray forces, right? Like the zombies of society. There is a book that I have not read, but I listened to a great interview on William Ramsey. It's called Raising Hell. And apparently later on in the book, they detail allegedly, maybe not, that Robert de Grimston was teaching at a university not that far from Staten Island, and a woman that he may or may not have been seeing was a lawyer that was involved in some of the Son of Sam crimes. I'm trying to find a hard copy of this book because I can't find it anywhere. It's not on Amazon. I can't find it on eBay.
What's it called again?
Raising Hell.
Okay. Did you
I'm
look on
gonna
archive.org?
Yeah, I looked and I can't find it because I want to figure out the timeline that they give because I would like to know. There was rumors that he was posing as a journalist when they were out looking for Jennifer Schweiger. There now they did print an article by him about, I think it said, what was it, Nixon? They accidentally printed it. I think they said it was 15,000 copies went to print in the New York Times. I found it in the archive and I saved it, where he writes an article about Nixon outliving Kurt Cobain. It's by Robert de Grimston.
Kurt Cobain, that's kind of random.
Yeah, it's very weird, and I'm just like, oh, okay, so he was maybe a freelance journalist, so maybe credence could be lent to the rumors that he was trying to get some interviews out on Staten Island when some of those things were going on. Maybe not. I don't know.
Well, the other interesting thing too, timeline wise, is that well, I guess it was to be a little early, but the whole Roy Raden situation on Long Island.
Yes.
Um, we know about these connections and of course, this brings in Robert Evans and Rosemary's Baby and the Curse of Rosemary's Baby, but that's a whole other topic for another discussion. But the the rumors or the evidence of ritualism in these kind of eyes wide shut type orgies that would take place at Raden's mansion. Now, I don't suppose that there's any evidence linking to Grimston or the process to those, are there?
Well, I would say that there's rumors. Obviously, I want to be careful too. There's rumors. I think that an interesting correlation that you brought up earlier that kind of ties into this is in regards to the celebrity scene, because the actress that was sexually attacked on film that Roy Braden got in trouble for, she worked with John Travolta on Welcome Back, Kotter.
Did that?
John Travolta John Travolta was in Devil's Reign. Anton LaVey consulted on that film.
The one with
So
Ernest Borgnine?
I think so.
Yeah. Wow. I'll have to look that up. That's crazy. And he's
So
also
it's
in Carrie too. So
yeah, there's just some interesting connections. And I think that, like we have John Travolta for like the Grease premiere party. He's at Studio 54. Obviously, we know Roy Cohn's at Studio 54. You know what I mean? There's just a lot of shady stuff going on. In my opinion, I think that what we are seeing theoretically, but I'm hoping I will be able to prove it, is that we are seeing some very early stage Iran Contra. That's what I think is going on,
hmm,
because Adnan Khashoggi's wife was a Scientologist.
no
So like,
kidding.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
Well, I want to throw another curveball at you. Um, there was a group based in Belgium, which is the whole other story altogether, called the Order of the Solar Temple. And they were notorious because starting in, I think, 93, there were these mass suicides when the bodies would be ritually arranged and immolated, quote unquote suicides. There's a lot of evidence that this wasn't suicides. And then in 1997, kind of all hell breaks loose. Now, if you read up on the Solar Temple, I mean, there's all this kind of things where, the Templars and Star Sirius and, some UFO kind of undertones there. But they strike me very much as being cut from the same cloth as the process. And if you watch these documentaries, I mean, there was a guy named Luc Jouret and another guy named Joseph DeMambro. I think Luc Jouret came out of like the whole New Age scene in Europe, and Joseph DeMambro, I believe, had intelligence and military ties and so on. But if you watch the videos, I mean, they filmed a lot of this stuff, a lot of their rituals and so on, and there was like sort of a sex cult aspect to it as well. Um, you really get a process vibe out of it. You really do. And I start to wonder, is there Scientology connection there? I mean, this would be something that you'd have to research, but I'm just sort of pointing this out. And another interesting thing about this, when you talk about celebrities, is that they were sort of involved in like what you would call a trademark dispute with a group that was the Sovereign Order of the Solar Temple that was based in Monaco. Okay. And some people have linked this group to Princess Grace, Grace Kelly's death in 1982. Now, Monaco, I mean, the de Grimston families probably wandered through there at one point or another in their history. Monaco, talk about the black nobility. You know what I'm
yeah.
saying? I mean, come on, right? Now, I don't even know if I have a question here because if you're not familiar with this group, you're not familiar with them, but it would be interesting to see you take a look at them and, just be the fact that this Jure guy is involved in like the New Age scene in Europe. I mean, there's all sorts of tie-ins with Scientology there. Um, but their ritualism and the robes and all this kind of stuff and a lot of their iconography just seems, like I said, it's almost like it comes from the same factory. Like it's stamped with the same molds that the process is. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to take you down a garden path here, but I think it would be really interesting to see you look into them because they are as dark and as sinister as it gets. And a lot of the people, and they weren't just like some Johnny come lately group. Like Scientology, they attracted a lot of European celebrities. actors, musicians, and so on. And that's why I'm just kind of wondering, like, hmm. Anyway,
I'm
just
very interested. I'm absolutely going to look into it because you're saying things that I'm like, yep, yep, yep. Like this all checks off for me. Yeah, absolutely. Because there are some other, crimes that were not included in the Ultimate Evil, but that were in Maury Terry's files. And, there were people that worked with celebrities. One of them was the designer for Cher. Another one was a very well-known artist in the
Are you talking
village.
about Bob Mackey?
I don't think his name is Mackie.
Okay.
I feel like if you knew it, if you said it, I would remember it. Because I had never heard of these people before, but they were two individuals that were supposedly witches. Obviously, the cops would not identify what coven or cult that they were involved in. And they were moved across state lines, which should have made it a federal case. It did not. But they were found with the same puncture wound on the same side of their body, matching bruises and a clump of hair in each of their hands, and they had been drained of all of their blood and just dumped on the side of the road. A very clear occult crime.
Mm.
And I followed the investigation as much as I could through the newspaper. It just disappears. Like after a year, they just stop investigating it.
So typical. Unbelievable. So let's talk about Michael Aquino now. Because again, I mean, Temple of Set, Process, Solar Temple. I mean, all these groups, like I said, all seem like they come from the same assembly line. They're just, different models, you know what I
Yeah.
mean, of the same make, let's just say. Um, Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Recluse. Are you familiar with Recluse of Vice
I've
View?
I've heard of him.
Okay, so he looked into Michael Aquino, and Michael Aquino's mother, and you've probably read about this, was involved with some bizarre types of eugenic super soldier type of program that took place, I guess, in the 40s, and that his mother was involved with this. Now, Aquino is a very, very curious character because he gloms on to LaVey, right? And then a few years later, he starts his own organization, the Temple of Set. And then, of course, we know all about the situation at the Presidio and so on. But there's also some doubt cast on his actual involvement with military intelligence and whether he was actually doing the things that he's claimed to do, writing textbooks on psychological warfare and so on. So let's give me the breakdown on Michael Aquino as far as your research is concerned. I mean, what have you uncovered that we don't know or we should know?
So I think in regards to Michael Aquino's mother being a part of the Gifted Kids program under Lewis Terman, the
Hmm.
thing that is very interesting about that is so she's under Lewis Terman, she goes to Germany, she takes the last train out of Germany before the war. Obviously, I think she got tipped off, and she comes back. But what you notice, and it is very weird, is that there is a predominance of newspapers in Utah that are talking about her. Obviously, Utah, you think of the Latter-day Saints, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Well,
Hmm.
I find this article, and she is sculpting a life-size shaped head of a young girl named Janet Forbes. Come to find out, this is Michael Aquino, later on his first wife. So it was Janet Forbes before Lilith Sinclair, Lilith Aquino. So Janet Forbes was a Mormon. And at one point, I think Michael is 2 years old, and I think Janet is probably around the same age for whatever reason. Michael and his mother go and stay with the Forbes family for an indeterminate amount of time per the newspapers. I have found one of the female researchers under Dr. Lewis Terman, and she is one of the originals who actually was working out of Utah and ended up teaching in Utah as well. And she was involved in a lot of the early stage development with infants from the first days of life, but she also studied second generation. So, in my personal opinion, because what happens is Michael and her get married, and it's her second marriage already, and she's 21. They get married and they're in the Church of Satan together. She is quoted as a satanic priestess, and she is also a registered nurse as well. After that, they get divorced. He goes and gets with Lilith. She gets with a man named Thomas Bullock, who was in Vietnam at the same time in Saigon as Michael Aquino. So, what he was doing was he was training everybody to smuggle drugs, contraband, any sort of ordnance out of Vietnam. That was his role. I don't know how much of a coincidence that is that she ends up marrying two guys that are involved in literally in Saigon with high ranking positions, you know what I mean?
Mm.
Um they split, but she immediately goes from being a satanic priestess to going back into the LDS church, which is very bizarre, especially for people who know about the current situation with the Levites and the satanic ritual abuse case. If you read those records, that does date back to that time specifically. As far as Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, he joins with Lilith. Lilith actually owned the Lilith Grotto, which is still a functioning charity that has never filed their paperwork out of New York. It's been open since like the late 70s, but that was a faction of the Church of Satan. And then in 75, he splits off and he starts the Temple of Set. As far as his factual history or his records, I mean, I think he made some pretty audacious claims. Like he was part of like space programs. I do think that he wrote Mind War. I think
Mhm.
that he absolutely wrote that. I think that there's a very good argument. He's made multiple interviews as far as being involved in the Phoenix program, specifically with Operation Wandering Soul. So, certainly, like what some might call like brain to skull technology now, whatever you want to call it. Um, I think that there is some credence there. I also think that there is some credence to what level he was ranked or protected. I don't know, but I found this very crazy article. It was from 1985 because it was before the stuff at the Presidio started happening. So him and his mother owned a property,
And her name was
and
Betty White, right?
it was so her name is Marion Dorothy Elizabeth Ford, but she goes by Betty. So people think Betty Ford and they think the
Oh,
old
Betty
First
Ford.
Lady
Yeah.
Ford.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then they,
Yeah.
and then they like go crazy when they see that. And I'm like, no, 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 not that Betty Ford. They owned this building, and a high-ranking lieutenant colonel in the army didn't know that a sex service was being run out of this building that they own. And they make a big stink about it. And, he's Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, and he believes in the First Amendment, but he has a liberal approach to the Constitution, and they haven't done anything wrong. And I'm like, okay, you're just like really persecuted, bro. Like, it's completely ridiculous. Um, but I mean, was he getting some sort of intelligence gathering from that? And then they just got
I
caught?
think it was Midnight Climax, right?
Well, that's separate. That's like MK with George Hunter White. But I'm saying,
No, but I'm
like,
saying it sounds like almost like
yeah,
the same line of thinking.
yeah, absolutely. That's how I felt about it. I'm like, that's a great way to get blackmail on people and also just
Jeffrey
general.
Epstein.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Was it, did Aquino have any Scientology connections?
That's what I'm working on right now. So once I found the grotto, Lilith Grotto, that Lilith was running, so technically she was running it out of New Jersey, but it covered the tri-state metropolitan area.
Do you know where in
And
New Jersey?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but
Oh,
I
sorry.
can send you the articles because I
Hmm.
found them because it's
No,
really
yeah.
crazy. She has a tie directly with Scientology, this parapsychological foundation, because Ingo Swann was a Scientologist.
Oh yeah,
I
they all
have,
were. They all were.
yeah, I have her there doing speeches with Ingo Swann. And I'm like,
Mm.
okay, so there's that tie. At least the door is open. Now I am going through the book that Michael Aquino wrote, The History of the Church of Satan, mostly trying to track down when and where what they were doing because he was in New York in 1974 and 1975 and maybe 1976. I'm not necessarily implicating him in anything, but I'm just saying those are high ranking Satanists technically before he opens the Temple of Set. And it is in the newspapers stating well established that the Long Island, or no, the Staten Island sect of the Lilith Grotto, they don't name the warlock who is heading it, but in his description of himself, he is part of the British Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, and also like some weird part of our Air Force. It just, he sounds like a spook. The way that he profiles himself, he sounds like a spook to me. He sounds like maybe a double agent. He's very evasive. But I had to go through this with the process where there was a period of probably like a month and a half where I was literally holding up pictures next to each other, like trying to figure it out. And then I was able to nail it down finally with a name in the newspaper and then get their actual records. So I've just got a long way to go.
Well, here's the thing. I remember, the name John Poindexter, right?
Yeah.
From Iran Contra and all that
Mhm.
good stuff. He said something that stuck in my mind, and it kind of really influenced. I'd written a novel called "He Will Live Up in the Sky" that covers a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. Particularly like military cultism and so on. But he said something that really influenced me very much. He said, "There's really not a lot of players out there." That so when we hear that these connections with this grotto and Staten Island and in the process and the Temple of Set and Scientology, it's just like these are actually very, very small groups of people. I mean, this is not a vast conspiracy. I mean, this is a very tightly knit group of people who know each other, who go in and out of each other's little cults and so on. So my question would be here is what evidence do we have just linking Aquino to the process?
Right now, we don't have anything. We don't have anything yet. Now, here's why I don't think that it's out of the question. First off, the clear tie from Aquino and especially his mother to the Mormons, to the LDS Church, because that is a very clear tie. Now, stepping back a little bit, because the narrative with the process itself is, they come to the States and, they go to California and then they just decide to leave, right? Well, that's really not true. I have them right after what happened at CLO Drive, immediately going into their Jesus Freak or Jesus People movement. So, what they do, I have them with the Children of God. I have them with the Mennonites. I have them like at Billy Graham rallies trying to infiltrate like every other Jesus people movement. They basically are able to cloak themselves because of the four deities. And as time passes and they're shaving off Satan, Lucifer, and then they just get down to Jehovah, and people identify that as the schism, but I think that the schism is for public consumption to give the appearance that that happened,
Mm.
because literally as soon as they leave California, I have them in the papers and in some of their magazines where they are linking arm in arm with the Children of God, saying that the Children of God is being persecuted for their religious beliefs, despite the New York Attorney General detailing the horrors that most people know about the Children of God. And the process is like, oh no, they're being unfairly persecuted.
Well, the curious thing about the children of God, I mean, I don't know. I mean, listen, that just smacks of CIA honeypot to me. I mean, just straight up, and just the whole operation, the flirty fishing and
Yep.
the missions and all. But the other curious thing to me is, I mean, Roz McGowan, the Phoenix family, probably others that I'm not coming to mind. I mean, just the fact that we have celebrities, of that generation sort of emerging, from the family, children of God, whatever they choose to call themselves at the time. And again, that kind of feels, like it's almost got a Scientology vibe to it as well. And when I talked about the Solar Temple, I mean, just the fact that celebrities are sort of weaving in and out of these operations is incredibly curious to me. And like I said, I mean, I think of David Berg as like a prototype for Jeffrey Epstein. You know what I mean? I mean, except for he was worldwide. Just the whole operation just smacks of spook to me.
I could not agree more. I think it is too, because it's interesting, the process when they lost the libel suit against Ed Sanders in the UK, that was in 1974. At that time, they stated that they had over 500,000 members worldwide, and they were in over 100 cities in the United States. The Children of God, David Berg, claims that they had run to Europe, when that investigation in New York was going on, but they made it very clear that they were all over the United States as well. And what I'm trying to show people is, because in that New York AG investigation, they show some of the teachings for the upper echelon of the Children of God, and I have all the process stuff. I'm trying to show people with like Scientology, the old CIA of the church, the Guardian's office, the process, Children of God, gonna be looking at the Moonies, because the Moonies and Children of God and Scientology make this weird front group after Jonestown. That way they don't get investigated. But all of their paperwork, as far as their rules, it's the same across the board. They're just using different words. It's
Mm.
very bizarre.
Like I said, cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
Now, since you started this with the Franklin cover-up, what is your take on the Johnny Gosh Aquino connection or alleged connection?
I
With that
feel,
ranch where the boys were kept and everything like that.
yeah, I feel like I feel like there's I feel like if there was something there that was going to bear fruit, people that are smarter than me have been looking into this for so long, and it sounds like the police were extremely corrupt. So I don't
In
think that it,
the Iowa police,
yeah,
Iowa City, what
absolutely.
is it, Sioux City, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think that there's a very good argument that something absolutely bad did happen. I just don't know that Aquino was necessarily involved, because it's interesting. So, like tying that into Boys Town and the Franklin scandal in general, I had taken a different approach to the current Utah SRA case that's been going on.
Mm.
So the guy that was the crux of it, his name is Nicholas Alaverdian, but he's painted as this massive sex criminal who changes his identity and escapes the country. And I said, that's a lie, because you can't do that. That makes no sense, especially just this random kid. So I looked at it as, let me see what his backstory is and if there's any validity to it. Well, come to find out, he got laws passed in Rhode Island, and you can read the transcripts of the court records. So he was in the foster care system there for, I think, like half of his youth. But he had 16 state representatives that testified on his behalf, and they were aware that Boys Town, two people that are named in the Franklin scandal as well, that they were doing this massive network through DCYF and Child Protective Services as well. So, like, this is an operation that's still going on today, and it's
Mm.
thriving today. And it's
Mm.
interesting because Police Chief Wadman, Yeah, Police Chief Wadman from the Franklin scandal. He
Hmm.
ties into the Leavittes in Ukraine because I have him in
Ukraine.
Ukraine. Yeah, I have him in Ukraine with them where they're bringing democracy with the Leavitt institution. Yeah,
Oh, good God. Oh, it's one big happy family, isn't it? It's
it is.
one big happy family of occult sickos.
Yeah.
So, which brings me to my next topic of conversation, and this might not be something that has sort of fallen, under your aegis here, but I am very interested in the Getty family. Now, the Getty family, at one point, were the richest family in the world. Okay. And they made both a movie and a TV series about the kidnapping of John Paul Getty III. There was the whole thing where, Kevin Spacey had to be digitally replaced by Christopher Plummer and so on and so forth. Now, but the thing is that the Getty family were bankrolling Kenneth Anger when he was making Invocation of My Demon Brother and Lucifer Rising. It was the Getty Family Foundation and the Ford Foundation that were paying for him. He set up this operation off the Haight in the old Russian embassy. And this is where I actually interviewed Bobby Beausoleil from prison. So this is
Oh,
where Bobby Beausoleil shows up. We know that he left San Francisco and so on and went down to Los Angeles. And there's also the boy who was the son of some cult weirdo operating out of San Francisco and so on. Now, the Getty family were also patrons of Marjorie Cameron, who was married to Jack Parsons, who is related, well, not related, but is connected to Ghislaine Maxwell through Christine Maxwell, who was married to the son of the partner that Jack Parsons started, Jack Parsons
Melina.
Laboratory,
Yeah, Melina.
Ed Molina. Now, not a lot of people realize that Marjorie Cameron was naval intelligence, and she had top secret clearance. She was working in Washington, D.C., making maps. She wasn't summoned by, he and Hubbard going off into the desert to
No.
wave swords around and, do other things, have other activities. Her brother and her father were both working at, where were they working at? It might have been JPL. I think it was JPL. Yeah. So, I mean, this wasn't any magical summoning and so on.
No.
But, her work was always very explicitly satanic, obviously. I mean, you just look at it and, she did the depiction of Parsons as the angel of death and so on and so forth. So it's just very curious to me because, there's this whole lore on the internet about the tunnels under the Getty Center in Southern California. The fact that they are connected to at least two heavy hitters in the occult history of the 20th century, Kenneth Anger and Margaret Cameron. And also, Ivy Getty, when she was married, the wedding that was officiated by Nancy Pelosi, she requested that her guests, in lieu of gifts, make donations to best friends.
What?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I know what next rabbit hole I will be diving down because that's a red flag city to me.
Yeah, and like the day before, I think it was the day or a couple of days before Ivy Getty gets married, and all the, people like Gavin Newsom and all these people, the Newsoms and the Pelosi's are very closely tied in with the Gettys. Um, the Best Friends Animal Society has the Empire State Building on 33rd Street obelisk, right? Illuminated in red, ostensibly for the Clifford the Big Red Dog live action picture. But this
Sure.
is this is right before Ivy Getty is married, and requests that her guests donate to best friends. And in the middle of all this was Astroworld with Travis Scott and the people just sort of dropping dead in the crowd and everything. So this was a pretty eventful week. So my question to you is, has the Getty family shown up in, say, your work, the West Coast sort of wing of your work, whether it's Scientology or the Mansons or the process? I mean, I would imagine that a family that powerful, who, just 50 years ago were the richest family in the world, now I'm sure, the money's all been diverted. But, the son Balthazar Getty is in Lost Highway, David Lynch film that Marilyn Manson's also in. He's a very interesting guy all by himself. And then the other Getty brother who makes that weird horror movie. Have you seen that? Oh, what's the title of it? I forget the title, but it is sick and weird. It came out, he died. It was released posthumously. So has there been any connections? Because there's just way too much smoke with this family for there to be no hellfire, let's just say.
Absolutely. I have not seen anything with them, and I'll tell you why, because I'm just trying to identify everybody, like who they are factually, because there's the Brotherhood of Eternal Love that's kind of running in the background during all of this, which is making things very complicated because I think that the drug angle is a huge part of it.
Is that
And
Hollingshead's operation? Michael Hollingshead?
that was Timothy Leary, Ronald Hadley Stark. God, who else was in it?
Well, Hollingshead was the British intelligence agent who first turned Leary on. He had
Okay.
the famous, I think it was like a mayonnaise jar filled with acid,
Oh,
gave Larry some doses from it. But I believe that he was involved with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love or whatever it was called.
probably because in that Senate hearing that they had about them, they talk about how like they were literally traveling everywhere with fraudulent passports and they didn't know what half of their names were. And it's interesting because as the process is going to Stuhl, Timothy Leary and his daughter are also going at the exact same time, but they get busted by Border Patrol, and the daughter has crystal meth on her or like methamphetamines, and he has weed, and so they go to jail. And according to the Church of Scientology, the process was doing paramilitary training in Stuhl.
And this is just before Hurricane Inez, right?
Yes.
Okay, 1966.
Yeah.
What
But
were
the
they?
Getty,
But see, but that whole area is huge drug trafficking
yes, absolutely.
network center. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting angle, but the Gettys, that's interesting to me because that brings in some of the financing because especially if like you said, there are only a limited number of actual like power players. The rest of them is just sort of like factional, whatever. But you still have to be able to fund them and sustain them. And obviously, things got really hairy in California with the motorcycle gangs, and they really had
Mm,
to shift out of there.
mm.
But I want to look into that because I'm trying to see if there's any other MK CIA doctors besides some of the more heavily contested ones like Jolly West tied into all of it.
Jolly West is contested. How is he contested?
Well, the ex-Scientology community hails the late Dr. Louis Joyland Jolly West and Dr. Margaret Sanger that they are heroes because they spoke out against Scientology. They were very outspoken critics in the anti-cult movement. So,
Jolly West was. That's
uh,
interesting. That is very interesting. Um, does that connect up to the what is it, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation? Have you done any work into them? Because
oh yeah.
they were just littered with MK Ultra alumni.
Yes, they were within the first year and a half of being open, I have at a bare minimum four CIA doctors. There is Dr. Martin Orn, Richard Offshee, Margaret Sanger, and Jolly West, and then obviously the current girl boss of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, Elizabeth Loftus. She was on that board from the get-go.
The one who testified in defense of Ted Bundy.
And
Is the-
Ghislaine Maxwell and Harvey Weinstein and Timothy McVeigh
Yeah,
and
she's
OJ
a yeah,
Simpson.
yeah,
Yeah.
she's a real charmer,
Hmm.
that one. Now, when you talk about Elizabeth Loftus, I was very happily surprised that you had mentioned Loretta Bender because nobody talks about Loretta Bender anymore. And she is a woman who makes Sidney Gottlieb, look like a saint. And she was a level of evil that if people knew about, and actually the CIA actually suppressed a lot of that information because they said if people wouldn't understand if they got out, they'd get the wrong idea, right? But we talked about this. I did a live stream on Wonder Woman. Now, Wonder Woman, you think, well, what does Wonder Woman have to do with anything? Well, Wonder Woman was created by William Moulton Marston, who is, when you say, I don't know if you, I was, when you were saying Margaret Singer, I was thinking of Margaret Sanger. He was tied in with Margaret Sanger and that whole crowd. But he also taught, he was one of the first instructors for psychological warfare in the Army. I think it was Fort Benning. Um, and then he became sort of like a Dr. Phil celebrity psychologist, claims to have invented the lie detector test, and then quote unquote invents Wonder Woman, which is just sort of a pastiche of characters that were already existing. But so and they actually made a movie about him because he was polyamorous and he was sleeping with his students, and he had this three-way going on with his wife and a student, and it's just they had to make a movie of it. They did not include Loretta Bender. Now, the reason why Loretta Bender is so interesting to me, not only the fact is that she was just doing these Auschwitz level experiments for decades in New York on orphans and the mentally retarded and so on. But there's a woman named Josette Frank, who was another famous psychologist, and she was hired by a company that later became DC Comics to just basically sort of sign off on all these comics and say, tell parents these are wonderful and these are great for your kids. And it got to the point with Wonder Woman, which was just filled with pedophilia and bondage and all the sickness, that she said, I can't do this anymore. This stuff is sick. This is like worse than pornography. She believed it was more damaging to children than pornography was, and so on and so forth. Because, she used the term sex antagonisms because this all sort of is implied lesbianism and so on. But so she quit, and the woman who replaced her was Loretta Bender. So Loretta Bender comes in, working for DC, signing off on all these comic book stories, one of which was Wonder Woman, when she's not, you know, sending children into comas with weird drugs and with what did she use? There's a couple of different drugs that she used.
She liked acid and meth.
Yeah, but she was using what is that? What did diabetics use again?
Insulin. Oh, insulin
Insulin.
shock therapy.
Yeah,
Yep.
insulin shock therapy. So she was I was like, oh, thank you. Somebody else noticed Loretta Bender because nobody talks about her. And this is she did eventually get sort of pulled into the whole MK Ultra, that whole Josiah Quincy Foundation, that whole network, and so on and so forth. But she was doing that stuff before, she was doing this stuff in the early 40s, right? I mean, and maybe even the late 30s. I would have to check. But my question is, and I know you've mentioned her in a couple of tweets. Have you found any deeper connections with her in some of these stranger programs? Because we do know that a lot of this weird stuff, the weirdness and the witchcraft and everything sort of comes up in MK Often in the mid 60s when MK Ultra is quote unquote closed down. And that was very, had a very heavy base in chemical agents and so on and so forth. Now, do you have any reason to believe, or have you done any research into her, this whole network at Bellevue and so on? And not just the MK Ultra stuff that we know about, but this weirder stuff as well. I mean, is there any connections with any of these players in Yonkers and Son of Sam with Bellevue at all that you know of?
Not with Son of Sam, and it doesn't mean that they're not there. So I think that Lewis Terman, and there's this paper where it details his first female researchers, and the women seem to be engaged in just straight up barbarism. They are much
Mm,
more barbaric than him. And like this
mm.
this one doctor, Nancy Bailey, my most recent thread, Lewis Terman's Terrible Women, like her research dates back to the 20s.
Oh my
So
God,
i
yeah.
i want to see how far back, because I want to see if I because I guess I had never really considered it before, but working with children in this aspect, specifically, this doctor is working with what makes babies cry, what makes them scared, what makes them want to kill. But with Loretta Bender, I think she's doing that without necessarily saying it, in a different way with those drugs. Because this is so dated with them, I feel like there is some sort of tie, and I want to see what I can find that would predate technical MK, artichoke, bluebird,
Mm.
because I feel like there is something there that maybe even precedes Dr. Terman. But it seems like the women are heavily engaged in barbarism with infants and young children. They're doing the most extreme research. But Lewis Terman, he takes on a role that is very similar to Dr. Kinsey, as far as the perverted part of it.
Oof.
He forces everybody to give extremely detailed information to him throughout their life about everything that they do.
Well, and of course, Kinsey's connected directly to Kenneth Anger,
Yes,
which would
yes, he
connect him
is.
to the Getty organization.
Mm.
No, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with my work, but I firmly believe that MK Ultra itself, and then following on with these successor programs, um, really had nothing to do with mind control as we think of it. Okay, as we think of like Manchurian Candidate kind of stuff, I think that that would be more like Bluebird and Artichoke and so on. I think that MK Ultra, and just knowing like how weird a dude Sidney Gottlieb was, he was like a weird dude, right? And I think that their goals were supernatural. Okay. I think that their goals were, and the reason being is that studying the work that Cameron was doing up in McGill in Montreal, and the thing that really struck me hard was that a lot of the methodologies that they were using were basically just high-tech updates of the methodologies that would be used like in shamanic training and other like tribal customs and practices. They're basically doing the same thing with, instead of like a bunch of monks sitting in a circle while a boy is being raped and tortured, they're doing it with tape recorders and so on, or whatever, or insulin comas, mega doses of LSD or whatever. See, I think, and I know that I'm sort of an outlier in this, but in light of the fact that these practices have well established, well recorded antecedents in these cultic, spiritual, tribal practices, however you choose to frame this. And the fact that people who, actual doctors, real doctors who went through Cameron's materials and said, this has no basis in science whatsoever. There's nothing scientific about any of this. It's just not there. And I think that, the term they used was, there's absolutely no basis in scientific methodology here. And there was the whole idea that one of the doctors who worked under him said, our goal is to erase one personality and replace it with another. Well, where do you get that other personality? Okay. I mean,
Right.
I've always, and I've said this for several years now, and I realize I'm an outlier on this, but I think it was about possession. It was about conditioning suitable vessels for spiritual possession.
I agree. I agree
Okay, you agree with
completely.
me?
No, I
Okay.
do because I mean I look at I understand that there are people who are practitioners and believe in the occult. Pick one, it doesn't matter. However, at the end of the day, I feel like that whole angle is like a shore story to throw off investigations. That way these things don't actually get investigated, or people like the late Maury Terry, take a very sort of old school Catholic approach where it's, sort of like Leo Taxel, like there's demons under, every rock, and I don't fault him for it. But as far as the root of the technology, whether you want to talk about like remote viewing, ESP, telepathy, whatever the case may be, it's there. I agree. I feel like the whole concept of them trying to, if people want to call it Manchurian Candidate, it does feel like it is a spiritual sort of possession. And it's unnatural, in my opinion. I'm not telling anybody what to believe, but I mean, in my opinion, it would be a negative possession because they're going to, whoever they are going to use it to their own ends. You know what I mean? They're going to use it to their benefit and they have complete plausible deniability, and you don't know what happened. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? But there is no scientific basis for it. Like, what was that? Psychic driving that he was
Mm,
doing? Like, what was the
mhm.
scientific basis for that? None.
Well, see, but here's the thing that I want to bring up, and I sort of bring it all back home with this, is that, you'd mentioned the remote viewing and the telepathy and so on. So that would be like Grill Flame and Stargate and all these projects, again, with these heavy, very, very heavy Scientology connections through, Ed McMonagle and you mentioned Ingo Swann and all these people up and down the line. But, as I'd mentioned before, MK Often, which is a very mysterious and very poorly recorded program, but there have been claims and I would say well-educated claims that this was occultic in nature because this program is started by Stephen Aldrich, who I believe is connected to the Rockefeller family, right? Because there's the Aldrich family and so on. In 1966, and they it's known that they made use of this British witch who became like the celebrity witch. But if you look at sort of that point where we have like 66, early 67, everything's flower power, everything's positive and sunny and everything. And then everything it's like, Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead and Altamont and Anton LaVey and Kenneth Anger and just all this intense darkness and occultism just starts flooding the public consciousness. And one of the things that I've said, and this is another thing I kind of get in trouble with, is that you always hear, oh, satanic panic, right? Well, you know, people were being bombarded with satanically themed movies, books, records, TV shows, comic books from the late 60s on. And it became really pervasive. And as you and I both know, there were any number of occult and satanic crimes being committed that, that they're trying to bury, by bringing up, McMartin daycare or whatever, so on and so forth. And there are questions about that we can get into at another time. But I start to think that if we look at, on one hand, the telepathy and remote viewing. And on the other hand, this absolute tsunami of satanic themed entertainments, let's just say. Um, and then tied back to this quote unquote end of MK Ultra and the beginning of MK Often. To me, it doesn't seem coincidental. And the other thing, since you mentioned that you read Program to Kill, um, you can draw two curves, the rise and fall of the serial killers concurrent with the rise and fall of serial killer movies and TV shows and so on and so forth. And then, they follow the same arc, start in the late 60s and then start to peter out, like say in the mid 90s, mid to late 90s. That doesn't seem like coincidence to me. I think, it was deliberate. It was deliberate. And also movies, I mean, have you heard about they showed Night of the Living Dead had its premiere in Chicago at a children's matinee.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's not literally like trauma. They're not
Trauma-based mind
traumatizing.
control.
Yeah. So in my opinion, I think, and it is just my conspiracy theory, I guess, is I think that the Satanic Panic started technically like with Manson. I think that that was the beginning of it, was sort of like culturally shocking everybody at once with what they did and making such a show of it. And then things obviously we have the other serial killers in California that just happen to be around like UC Santa Barbara and UC Irvine and UCLA. But then they go to New York, and then we have the Son of Sam crimes, and then we have this sort of interesting middle with like Gacy and Dean Corlman and these other seemingly unrelated networks of, like stuff and murder and
Chicago
maybe,
Ripper crew, right?
yeah, and the Chicago Ripper crew, yes, absolutely. Um, I I don't think that it's an accident either, because I was looking randomly at George Hunter White, and I was like, well, I'm just going to do a little deep dive on him and see if I can find any ties to Manson. And I haven't yet, but I did find a friend of his. It's Dr. Harvey Powelson. So he was chief of psychiatry at the University of California, and I think the paper that I found, it was the first mention of it in 1965, where he is heavily involved in LSD and astral projection research. And they're detailing, as far as the occult roots, the mysticism roots of it. And they're giving these firsthand accounts of people who are saying that they can astrally project by looking in a mirror, but they are literally terrified because they don't know what's going to happen. And there are multiple people who say that they don't want to do it and they're scared to tell anybody because they think that they'll be locked away for life. So I
Hmm.
think that California is one of the major hubs. I think that New York is a major hub too, because these are very easy access points as far as academia and occult activity, if you want to call it. But I absolutely think that the whole thing was created. They were doing the research to try and find the ways to create those access entry points within us, within our minds, our bodies, whatever way they could do it. And they are also
Portals.
pumping. Yeah, they're also pumping into the press, the strategy of tension, if you want to call it, fear with the crime, and then with the entertainment that goes right along with it.
Well, have you while we're on the subject, have you looked into Zodiac at all?
Not yet. I'm already putting my like cards on the table though. There's just no way it's not related. I'm sorry. These things are just, it's like 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, especially with the process, because when you read the court records from the lawsuit that they lost against Ed Sanders, you find out that not only were they in California like 3 or 4 years earlier than what they said, they never left. They
Mm.
just sent a group to New York.
See, my opinion on Zodiac, and I guess this is more of a cross that bridge when we come to it kind of thing. But I think that it was a military operation. and I think there were a team of zodiacs. And that's why we have all these people swearing up and down that, oh, my father was the zodiac or my neighbor was the zodiac. I know who the zodiac was, blah, 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 blah. But the fact that the zodiac watches were worn by, I think, was it Navy SEALs or something? People in the Navy, maybe Navy SEALs or frogmen or something. That to me is a kind of a tell. And also the cryptography that was used. I mean, that stinks of military intelligence, so on and so forth. So this is something we can get into. I mean, I don't necessarily know that it would be tied in with the process per se, but it's interesting because that sigil, that zodiac sigil is not entirely unlike the process sigil, is it? That sort of faux swastika that for
Right.
some reason is this exact same symbol that the Chase Bank, the Rockefeller Bank uses.
Yeah. Yeah. Symbolism will
Oh,
be their downfall. That's the joke, right?
yeah, that's a joke. Believe me,
Yeah.
that's a joke. Yeah. Anyhow, we've been going on for an hour and 45 minutes here, and this has been just absolutely amazing. The time just zipped by.
Yeah.
We'll have to do a follow-up on this, but your information is just absolutely fascinating. Your research is top rate, absolutely solid. And I'm sorry that you're getting pig piled on by all these trolls on Twitter. That's unfortunate. But what is it when you take the most flack when you're over the target, so to speak? I mean, God, I mean, who the hell knows who these people are? Some of these accounts, and we know it's been proven that military people and intelligence people create fake accounts and harass people on social media and so on. So I would take it as a backhanded compliment that you're getting
It is. I like
attacked.
to I like to tell people I'm out here fighting demons. So
Yeah, well, maybe that hits a little closer to the truth than some people might want to realize. But so where can people check out what's the best place to find you? Is it just on Twitter?
I'm on YouTube. My username is Rotting Jewels. So that's where
Mhm.
I go live. I basically just like take people through live research. And
Mm.
then I am on Twitter at Dana Doodah. I just upload my little schizo music clips, my propaganda stuff. That just goes on Instagram. But my live long form research is on YouTube. That's where you can find me.
Rotting Jewels.
Hmm.
Okay, I'll put a link in the description, as the kids like to say these days.
Yes.
Anyhow, this has been absolutely amazing. I feel like we just barely scratched the surface on all these
Me too.
topics. There's so much more to talk about, but we shall do so in a follow-up,
Yes,
hopefully.
that would be great.
If you will indulge me, I would
Oh yeah,
appreciate
this
that.
was a blast. The time flew by. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's already this late. But yeah, absolutely. Because I would like to kind of look at the Gettys and see if maybe I can find something weird with the Straight Theater, because the Straight Theater is where they premiered Invocation of My Demon Brother. So I have a feeling that maybe that's an interesting tie that I've not looked at yet.
Well, that's also where Kenneth Anger did his Equinox
Yep,
ritual, and he's
that's right.
flying the Nazi flag around and so on.
Yeah,
And it's funny because he passed away not too long ago, and all these people are singing his praises because they don't know anything about him,
exactly.
and they all seem to ignore the fact that he did that absolute straight up Nazi propaganda film not so long ago
Yeah,
with all the Hitler Youth. So it was sort of like a double whammy with Hitler Youth being sort of like a pedo wank for occult Nazis.
seems to be a trend, right? Seems to be a trend.
But it's funny because everybody just sort of just skips by that, it's just sort of skips by that aspect of his personality. I had actually interviewed him as well. I'd done an article for Classic Rock on Lucifer Rising, the whole, and I'll tell you something, by the time that I was done, like I was just so sickened by it all, just the absolute squalid and depressing reality of the occult rather than the mysterious mystique of the occult that people seem to play up. It's all just so squalid and ugly
I
and
agree.
weird and depressing. But so I interviewed Kenneth Anger. We had to pay him $300 because he just got out of jail. He was homeless. This guy, he was in his early 80s at the time, was homeless, was arrested. He was a big meth head at the time, 80-year-old meth head, and was
Nice.
arrested for he was staying in this flop house and he tried to strangle the woman at the front desk.
Lovely.
Yeah, just a really charming man, really charming man. And we had to pay him $300 to get him to talk to us because he was starving. He needed to buy like bread and peanut butter and so on. So when you deal with the devil, you always get the shit end of the stick.
Absolutely.
Okay,
There's a
that's
price.
yes, and the price you usually pay the price in the worst way before you leave this earth.
I could not agree more.
Yes. All right, so listen, I'm going to end this now. Again, Dana at Rotting Jewels YouTube channel. Her work is absolutely phenomenal. Head and shoulders
Thank
about
you.
anybody who's doing this kind of work these days. There's so much bad conspiracy research out there that it almost turns you off because there's so much cutting and pasting and then all the Q stuff and so on and so forth. She is doing this is the real deal. This is the real
Thank you.
deal. People will really get a lot out of it. Just, put your spiritual armor on because she gets into some really dark corners of the human psyche and soul. All right, this
Thank you.
is the Secret Sun Video Mystery Hour. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you again soon.